Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Across America, attacks intended to silence opponents on both the left and the right have become the price of political life. The assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk highlights a terrible truth from which Canada is not immune. Political violence is on the rise, and in many ways it can be traced to this country's own polarization problem. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm joined by Justin Ling, freelance journalist and author of the Bug-eyed and Shameless newsletter, to discuss the current state of our political culture and how our own fractious politics online is preventing healthy division. Justin, such a pleasure to welcome you back to the podcast. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
As concerns around, rising political violence in the U.S. Are growing in the wake of Kirk's death, it got us thinking here about what the reality is in Canada. Can you just start by painting a picture for us? What is the public appetite, I suppose, for political violence here?
Frankly, I think next to none. And I know that maybe that sounds almost borderline naive, but we're in a really interesting spot at the moment, right? We're in an interesting spot where we have faced actually maybe a disproportionate amount of political, ideological, religiously motivated violence over the last 20 some odd years. We have faced a slew of attacks on civilians, on the parliament buildings. We faced an attempted murder of the prime minister just less than 5 years ago. So we've actually dealt with a ton of this over the last number of years. You can see the stats. Hate-motivated violence has gone up considerably over the last decade. But here's the strange caveat. Like with everything in relation to our relationship with America, we tend to often define ourselves in the opposite, right? And what you have seen in Canada in recent days is a level of mirroring of the rhetoric and the sort of heated discourse you're seeing come out of the American right and the Republican Party and around from supporters of Donald Trump, but not very much of it, to be honest. You saw kind of isolated mentions of it, a protest, kind of anti-immigration protests that were scheduled across the country that largely were unimpressive. You've seen a little bit of online discourse around this, but you've not seen the sort of high-level, high-anxiety, high rhetoric, high emotion response in Canada, I think in large part because even people who liked Charlie Kirk in this country are watching the state of discourse in the U.S. and are feeling quite nervous about it. I think even some of the more extreme groups in this country have become more and more marginal over the last couple of months as you've seen this sort of national anxiety turn towards what's happening in the U.S. And now maybe this is all a little optimistic. Maybe things will change in the coming weeks and months, but I don't think so. I think when you have the sort of perverse luxury of watching a state kind of succumb to its worst instincts, it gives you kind of clarity on what you ought to be doing. And I think most Canadians are looking at that and going, this isn't for us.
So just to make the distinction here, the threat of political violence perhaps is rising on this side of the border, but the prospect for it, not necessarily. It's not like our tolerance for it is also growing.
I don't think it is. And I think there's something really important to underscore in this as well. So let's put aside even what's happening with the Trump administration right now. The trend in political violence in North America over the last 10 to 15 years has changed significantly and in ways we weren't really anticipating. What we have seen has actually been a kind of substantial decrease in the number of ideological, political, and religious motivated extremist attacks. There have been some, but the majority of attacks we've seen in recent years have been this sort of alternate explanation that we're still sort of grappling with. Many experts call it salad bar extremism, which is a really cute name for a really dark thing. It describes a type of extremism that really isn't totally concerned with any one type of political ideology or purpose. It really can be described as violence for violence sake. There might be ideological facets of it, but they're often in competition with each other, and in some cases are just outright contradictory. You could see somebody who is pro-gay marriage, but also anti-immigration and tries to kill a leftist, right? Like, you could see an instance where, and you can look at the assassination attempt of Donald Trump is a great example. Somebody who was probably to some degree a fan of Donald Trump who tried to kill him, right? You see these instances where nihilism and the sort of fetishization of violence becomes the end unto itself, which isn't to say you should ignore the online radicalization that happens here or the the pro-violent political rhetoric you see coming from some spaces online and in real life, but it does just say that things have gotten quite weird and we have not fully grasped the particulars of this. There's a lot of rhetoric happening right now, just to bring it back to our current moment. There's a lot of rhetoric that says the left is responsible, the Democratic Party is responsible. You've even seen Canadian journalists visited and blamed for their supposed role in the discourse that led to this assassination. But that's complete hogwash. It's complete BS. There's very little evidence for this. What we have seen instead is a really kind of insular online communities where people spend far too much time and wind up with a warped worldview that leads to them convincing themselves that violence is either necessary, inescapable, good, or a way to achieve sort of permanent notoriety. And I think that is far more interesting, far more dangerous, but it's also far more limited.
I would suggest, based on what you've just described there, that some of this is or can be traced back to just the general polarization of our politics. Is that the underlying force lighting the match in all of these cases? Is this what links them?
So I want to be really careful to not link some of this violence to actual rhetoric in the real world. I'm going to suggest that in many cases, this violence kind of would have happened regardless of what the rest of us are saying, right? The conversations we're having right now or in Parliament or in the newspaper is so far removed from the conversations that are happening on, let's say, 4chan or on some private Discord servers, or that is happening in kind of closed off, corners of even Twitter or Truth Social or Gab or whatever, right? So there is such a divorce there from those two things that I tend to be really skeptical of the idea that one feeds in directly to the other. But it is important to note that there are instances where this polarization does drive actual violence, or at the very least excuses it, and in worst cases it weaponizes it, right? And that's where I think the polarization really comes into play. You're already seeing J.D. Vance just hosted Charlie Kirk's show just this week anyway, and he repeatedly and consistently said political violence is a problem, not uniquely, but way disproportionately of the left. You've seen others very specifically say that trans people are responsible for this violence. So what you're seeing here is an exploitation of the violence for their own political ends. That exploitation could lead to more violence. I think more likely it could lead to actual state action against speech. There has been conversations about restricting gun ownership to trans people. There have been conversations about holding media companies, quote unquote, accountable for their discourse around the president. There have been conversations about going after people on social media, about getting people fired, about effectively canceling people who say and think the wrong things about the president and his supporters. That, to me, is where things get really dangerous and really worrying, because you're not just talking about the mental state of a handful of people who are already being radicalized, who are a danger potentially to national security. Not talking about a handful of people, dozens of people, hundreds of people. We're now talking about government decisions, state-led action that could affect millions of people and democracy writ large. That's where things get really worrying for me. But this is a strange and sort of uncharted territory we're in. It's not really mapped out we're still kind of speculating at this point. I mean, I guess there's some hope that cooler heads will prevail, but I mean, you're right. The state of polarization suggests that people are going to continue driving this, what we call effective polarization, and they're going to continue weaponizing each other's reactions, actions here to kind of pursue their own political ends.
To put this in the Canadian context, when you think of most recently, for instance, former NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, who had to be assigned, round-the-clock RCMP protection. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has also spoken out about increased threats towards him and his family. What are the forces driving it here? Is it polarization as well?
Yeah, it's polarization, and it's an exploitation I'm talking about. Like I said, we've seen a bit of a decrease in that sort of political intimidation and violence, but it's not gone away by any stretch. And I think Pierre Poilievre made that quite clear when he was responding, I think speaking to the CBC, where he mentions, his family is facing kind of constant death threats. Rachel Gilmore, the journalist who went up on a list of people who are supposedly responsible for the assassination, she receives deluges of death threats. Jagmeet Singh, of course, they try to enact a citizen's arrest of him on the street. This sort of stuff is being driven by polarization in a sense, but more particularly, a lot of it is being driven by, I think, two things that are really kind of both sides of the same coin. One is, the high octane, high emotion, distorted reality provided to us by social media. And the other part is the conspiracy theories and misinformation that have really taken root there and become endemic. And, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna about this. I mean, people have been kind of warning about the dangerous sort of rhetoric existing on social media for ages, and I'm not sure that it was always entirely fair, but we're now living in a world where one of the biggest social media platforms in the world, the one still used by the vast majority of Canadian journalists and media outlets and government agencies and politicians, Twitter, is being run by a guy who says that it is his goal to promote basically a kind of distorted version of right-wing politics. He explicitly spends his time calling out and targeting leftists who he thinks are responsible for the decline of civilization. He spreads conspiracy theories nonstop, which is obviously bad unto itself, but he's also actively manipulating the algorithm of his platform to make sure that more and more people see this stuff. And I'm not sure this is a thing that people 100% always grasp. TikTok is not designed to give us news or information. It's designed to keep us maximally addicted to the app, even if it's just causing outrage or paranoia or belief in conspiracy theories. To a large degree, this is true for Instagram and YouTube as well. And then you get all of the other platforms like Truth Social, literally run and owned by the president, which is a hotbed of violent rhetoric. There's also Gab, there's 4chan, like I said, there's Telegram, there's all these other platforms where conspiracy theories run rampant, where the community is actively participating in these things, and where they're developing a view of the world that is just fundamentally unreal and foreign from what we actually experience day to day. These are the online spaces where these violent actors live and get radicalized. So as I go through all this, to say that, these are the things that are driving harassment of our politicians, people who make these death threats, people who decide to kind of live and die online, and who use the internet to sort of litigate and prosecute their own political grievances and the ones that they've been fed and imagined through the internet.
I wonder, though, how much politicians themselves are to blame for that growing division of political discourse online, because, as we've seen with debates over things like climate, immigration, that's really just to name a couple, it often feels less about policy and more personal and more emotional.
There's no doubt that they bear some blame, right? And, I wrote a report a couple of years ago for the Public Policy Forum called Far and Widening. They coached on the show back then to talk about it. And I certainly lay some blame at the feet of our politicians and in some cases the media, who do opt to trade for high emotions as opposed to policy and kind of reasonable discourse. And I do think there has been a falling apart of our actual kind of human to human, person to person debate and conversation in this country. And I think that's been to a great negative effect. And certainly there are partisans who are overly defining themselves not in favor of what they support or what they want, but in opposition to what they think the other side is against, right? And we call this effective polarization. It tends to pull us apart like two negatively charged ions, and we go flying in opposite directions, and that rarely leaves us anywhere good. But again, you come down to this question of why are people doing this? Like, why is this happening? And the simple reality is it's because this is what social media demands of us, right? It is simply true. For many, many years, I think it's still true to a large degree, that anger-inducing content was promoted more aggressively by the Facebook algorithm, right? It is simply true that things that cause controversy and it provoke replies on places like Instagram and TikTok get fed higher up in the algorithm, meaning controversial content that might show, a crime that's been filmed or someone saying or doing something outlandish or horrible. That stuff rockets to the top of your page. And all of these things mean that the effective polarization we feel for one another is getting juiced and is supported and increased by the systems on which we're deciding to use to get our news, to have conversations, to follow our political leaders. And I know it feels simplistic to constantly blame just a handful of social media companies, including ones that maybe many of us don't even use day to day. But the reality is, this is core to the problem. These are the platforms on which our political staffers live day in, day out. These are the platforms on which our MPs decide to communicate with the general public, the platforms on which journalists get their news and talk to one another, and also the platforms on which hyperpartisans spend a lot of their day, and ultimately, as well, the place on which potential political terrorists find themselves obsessing over constantly. So I really do think that a lot of our problems of political polarization, of which there are many, but a lot of them flow back into this original sin, which is allowing this corrupted and capitalistic version of the internet to become the thing through which we decide to run our political system.
Short of abandoning social media altogether, though, what can politicians do to further prevent segmenting people, by their political or social ideologies? What steps can be taken, and what responsibility do they have?
I genuinely think abandoning social media altogether is a pretty good solution. At a certain point, how can one politician fix a platform that is being run by a multi-billion-dollar company, right? You're fundamentally one person against a billion-dollar company that is interested only in managing that discourse for their own ends and making profit off of it. You can't win, right? So I would suggest there's a handful of things you can do. One is stop using those platforms, Twitter in particular. I think the other ones maybe you can salvage. Try and engage in longer form conversations. I really think this is one of the core essential things our politicians have to do that they're terrified of doing. There's been a couple of examples of some of them doing it right. You can look to Nate Erskine-Smith, who does these long form videos where he kind of very clearly lays out his political positions, I think, to great effect. You can look at someone like Michelle Rempel in the Conservative Party, who uses Substack to lay out her positions and to have conversations with people. I think these are really good trends that are also, by the way, not social media in the way we've been doing it, right? It tends to actually look more like traditional broadcast or traditional newspapers, which I think is not a coincidence that this is a much better system. But I also think just getting back to using the traditional media is not a bad idea either. People, especially over the last number of months, have been really hungry for media that they can actually trust and rely on, that is not stuffed with AI garbage, that is not, constantly delving into these culture war interscene battles. And I think people, especially if they've been anxious about their jobs and about the economy and about the impact of tariffs, I think have started turning to the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail and the CBC again. So I think going back and re-engaging with those platforms is a really good idea, but also getting out in the real world and inviting people out to talk face to face. People want to be engaged again. They want to get brought outside. They want to meet new people. They want to learn how they can actually get involved in politics and not just sit behind their keyboard and be angry at it.
As you laid out earlier, there isn't quite an appetite for political violence here. But the threat of it and the fear of it is making it harder and harder for everyday people to participate in our politics. And I wonder what that tells you about the overall health of our country.
Yeah, and listen, even if there's not a huge appetite to commit violence, there's a huge appetite to threaten it, which I realize is a weird distinction. But the reality is, it has become very easy and very normalized for a certain segment of people to send an email or a tweet or a text message or make a call that says, "I'm going to find you. I'm going to kill you." And 98% of them don't mean it. 2% of them maybe do. And frankly, that number is so high that how could you not be terrified at all times? And that anxiety and that fear is real. Like I've talked to journalists, cabinet ministers, staffers who deal with that fear every day. And it can be really hard to go live your life. It can really even harder to go and govern when you face that daily fear. And it does dissuade people from entering politics, and it has convinced people to leave politics. And that's really unfortunate. Part of this is a policing problem. The police don't care about this. I have been told by senior cabinet ministers who have gone to both the local police, provincial police, and the RCMP, have explained their situation, and have gotten back to this sort of like, well, what do you want us to do response? And that is intolerable, right? Like, I want to live in a country where if you threaten death to a senior political figure, that the police are going to knock on your door, right? Like, that has to be the system we live in, and we know we live in. Because I think once you know you live in that system, the likelihood of you making that threat goes down significantly. So, I think that's a really important piece of this too, and it does have to be about, expectation setting and about kind of norm creation. We have to have politicians who come out and so thoroughly denounce this stuff, and we don't always do, right? Like, we don't always have politicians who are willing to challenge their own fringe supporters. And I've said this like a bunch of times over the last couple of years, but Pierre Poilievre has this problem. He has fringe supporters who do utter death threats, and I will underline fringe supporters, but who do utter death threats, who do, who are members of far-right groups who have spread kind of sexist, racist, homophobic stuff about our politicians, and who all too often aren't called out. I mean, he still goes and talks to The Rebel, Ezra Levant's quasi-journalistic media outlet that frequently spreads nonsense conspiracy theories and hateful nonsense about our politicians, which helps drive a lot of this distorted, polarized, paranoid hate. And I think I really do just want to see politicians who are willing to stand up and say, I'm not going to change my positions, I'm not going to water down my criticism of the government, but I am going to stop playing footsie and giving space to people who are engaged in the worst, most distorted version of that.
As many Canadians watch with worry, I suppose, what might happen south of the border in the aftermath of Kirk's death, what should be the takeaway?
The takeaway is we can insulate and inoculate ourselves against maybe not against every single attack by a lone, sad, angry, radicalized person, but we can inoculate ourselves against the insane fallout that has come from it already, right? Like, it is a thing that's within our power. We are not helpless. We are not weak. We are capable of creating a democratic system of a democracy more broadly that does figure out how to reconcile differences without violence, that does know how to mediate even really tricky conversations and fights without turning to this cancel culture, this deplatforming, these demands to have the state, enforce speech standards, or to have the state occupy cities or take over universities, right? Like, everything that America is dealing with right now is downstream of its inability to mediate and to deconflict these problems. And Canada has some of those same problems too. We're not nearly as bad as they are. And like I said at the beginning, I think there is a general appetite to define ourselves against where they're at. But that can't just be a passive thing. It can't be enough to go, oh, well, we won't get that angry. We won't get into those kind of fights. It has to be a positive thing. It has to be, we have to, re-engage in our national media so we can have national conversations not overly influenced by the American system. We have to have online conversations that are not run by their billionaires. We need to have a political system that exists totally independent of theirs. We need to be able to look at what's happening there and do, in some cases, the exact opposite. And I don't know, I still don't see that level of seriousness in our response.
Okay. Justin, thank you for helping us make sense of this all, and as always, for all your work. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
We love to hear from you on The Big Story. If you have feedback on this episode or any other, you can email us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. Leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend. You can find it on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.